In 1936, a woman in a pink negligee grabbed the telephone beside her bed, screamed 4 words into it, and died. The words were, "I've been shot." By the time anyone reached her room on the 7th floor of a downtown Chicago hotel, she was gone. A single bullet had pierced her heart. And when the police arrived, they ran into a problem they had never quite faced before. They did not know who she was. Not because there was no identity to find, because there were too many. The hotel staff knew her by one name, her neighbors knew her by another. And when detectives opened the drawers of that apartment and began to read, they found more. A third name, a fourth, and a whole hidden life, written out in her own hand. This woman had died with at least 3 different identities, and to this day, more than 80 years later, no one has ever been convicted of taking any of them from her. So this is not just the story of an unsolved murder. It is the story of a woman who was, in a sense, 3 different people, and of a killer who walked calmly into her room, sat down beside her bed, and knew exactly which of those women they had come to erase. If a genuine unsolved mystery is what you're here for, the subscribe button keeps them coming. Now let me introduce you to the woman with too many names. The date was the 2nd of July, 1936. The place was the LaSalle Towers, an elegant hotel in the heart of downtown Chicago. This was Chicago in the middle of the 1930s, a city that had spent years soaked in prohibition, gangsters, and glittering illicit nightlife, a place where nightclubs, wealthy men, and beautiful women moved in a world of money and secrets, just beneath the respectable surface of the city. It was exactly the kind of world in which a woman could quietly build several different lives at once, and no one would ask too many questions. In a comfortable apartment on the 7th floor lived a platinum blonde woman of 31. She was elegant, poised, and, to everyone who passed her in the lobby, entirely respectable. To the staff who saw her every day, she was Annabelle Blake, a poised, well-dressed lady who, they understood, was the retired owner of a successful cosmetics business. It was a respectable story, a self-made businesswoman, enjoying a comfortable retirement in a fine hotel. Almost none of it was true. That morning had begun like many of her mornings. She had just returned to Chicago by train, arriving from the East Coast. She had been out there visiting a wealthy man she had met not long before at a nightclub. A friend of hers, a nightclub master of ceremonies named Rolly Schenk, had picked her up from the station about an hour earlier and brought her home. The man she had been visiting on the coast had money, but no interest in anything permanent with her. That was the shape of her life. Wealthy men, glamorous nights, expensive trips, and connections that never quite became commitments. She traveled between cities to see the men who paid for her world, and then returned to her elegant Chicago hotel to rest. Back in her apartment, she ordered a late breakfast. She changed into a pink negligee to relax in bed. It was an ordinary, quiet morning for a woman who lived a very unusual life. Her friend Rolly left. A young elevator operator stopped by her room briefly to collect the breakfast tray. He lingered a moment to chat with the attractive blonde, before his elevator was called away. And then she had one more visitor. Someone came to her door. Someone she knew. Someone she was so completely comfortable with that she let them walk into her bedroom and sit down in the single chair beside her bed, on her right-hand side. There was no struggle. No alarm, no cry for help at first. Whoever this was, she trusted them enough to receive them while lying in bed in her nightclothes, as calm as could be. And then that visitor reached into their clothing, drew out a pistol, and shot her once in the chest. Later, the details of that single shot would tell investigators a great deal. The bullet had entered high on the right side of her chest and traveled downward. That meant the person who fired it had been standing on her right, close to the bed, firing down at her as she lay there. It matched the chair. It matched a visitor who had been sitting calmly at her right side, and who had risen, drawn a weapon, and fired almost point blank. This was not a shot fired in a struggle, or from across a room, or through a doorway. It was fired by someone standing right beside her, close enough to touch. Someone she had let sit there. Hold on to that detail, because it is the cold heart of this entire case. She was not afraid of the one who killed her. In a hotel full of staff and telephones and neighbors, she let this one person walk into her most private space. She let them settle into the chair beside her bed. A woman lying in her nightclothes does not do that for a stranger, or for someone she fears. She does it for someone familiar, someone welcome. Which means the answer to who murdered this woman was almost certainly not some intruder from the outside. It was someone already inside her strange, secret world. someone whose face she had seen many times before, perhaps someone she considered a friend. The killer fired one shot and fled the room, leaving her alone in those final moments. But she did not die immediately. In those final moments, she reached for the telephone on her nightstand, connected to the hotel switchboard, and forced out those 4 desperate words, "I've been shot." Then the line went quiet. Somewhere in that hotel, a switchboard operator sat holding a receiver, listening to nothing, having just heard a woman's last words. By the time a hotel man and a police officer reached the apartment, it was already too late. The room was quiet, the phone was off its hook, and the woman on the bed was beyond any help. The bullet had entered at a downward angle and torn through her heart. Nothing could be done. And that is when the real mystery began, because the police looked down at the dead woman and started asking a simple question. Who is she? The answer would take them a very long time to find, and the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Think about how a murder investigation normally begins. You start with the victim. You learn who they were, who they knew, who might have wished them harm. The victim is your map. Follow their real life outward, and you usually find your suspect somewhere along the way. But Audrey Vallette had no single real life to follow. She had several, and they barely touched. The people who knew Annabelle Blake did not know Audrey Schroeder. The people who knew Audrey Vallette did not know the polished cosmetics widow the hotel believed in. Every version of her led into a different set of rooms, a different circle of people, a different bundle of secrets. Detectives did not have one victim to investigate. They had 3 or 4, and each one had to be untangled from the others before the truth could even begin to come into focus. The first thing that struck the detectives when they looked around the apartment was the walls. They were covered in photographs, autographed portraits of famous people, stars of the stage, voices from the radio, faces from the movies, signed pictures from celebrities and champions, all gazing down at the bed where their acquaintance now lay dead. Among them were photographs from a famous entertainer of the day, and from a heavyweight boxing champion of the world. These were not distant idols she admired from afar. These were people she knew. People who had signed their portraits to her personally. This was not the apartment of a retired cosmetic saleswoman. This was the home of someone who moved among the famous, the wealthy, and the powerful. Someone with connections that reached into glittering circles most people only read about in the papers. So who was Annabelle Blake, really? She was not Annabelle Blake at all. That was one mask. To others who had known her, she had been Audrey Schroeder, a recent divorcee. That was another mask. Her real name, the one she had been born with, was Audrey Vallette. And here is a detail that makes her double life even sharper. Audrey Vallette did not come from the shadows. She came from a respectable, well-established family. Her own grandfather had been a clerk of a superior court, a known and respected man in the small Illinois towns where he had lived and worked. He had passed away only the year before her murder, spared the sight of his granddaughter's name, and secret life spread across the nation's front pages. This is the quiet tragedy underneath the glamour. Somewhere behind the gilded lady was just Audrey, a girl from a good, ordinary family who had chosen, or been drawn into, a life that her respectable grandfather would likely never have understood. This was a woman of good family who had built, on top of that respectable foundation, a series of entirely separate selves, different names for different people, different stories for different rooms. A woman who had, in effect, disappeared herself behind a wall of invented identities while she was still alive. There is a strange loneliness in a life like that. To be several people at once is to be fully known by no one. The hotel loved a woman who did not exist. Her admirers each knew a fragment, and the only place the whole, true Audrey seems to have existed at all was on the pages of her private diaries, written for no eyes but her own. And the police were about to find out exactly what those identities had been hiding, because in that apartment, they found her diaries. Not one diary, several. And when the lead investigator began to read them, he was, by his own account, stunned. The captain in charge of the case put it bluntly. Never in his life, he said, had he seen a diary so utterly unrestrained in its portrayal of the life its author had led. Page after page laid out a hidden world, a secret account of the real Audrey Vallette, written in her own hand, that had nothing to do with retired cosmetics businesses or quiet respectability. The diaries told the story of a woman who lived among wealthy and prominent men. A woman whose lifestyle, her fine hotel, her clothes, her travels, was funded by the powerful admirers she kept company with. She was, in the language of the time, a kept woman, a courtesan who moved through Chicago's glittering nightlife and counted influential names among her circle. And the press, when they got hold of all this, went into a frenzy, because a reporter had done something extraordinary at the crime scene. When the murder went out over the police radio, a Chicago newspaperman heard it and raced to the hotel. And in the confusion of that crowded room, with detectives and officers everywhere, he did something that would be unthinkable today. He stole the evidence. He grabbed personal photographs that had been given to Audrey by famous men. He spotted one of her diaries and a letter, and he took those too. Then he hurried downstairs, hailed a cab, and had it all delivered straight to his editor. The material was photographed for a front-page exclusive, and only afterward quietly returned to the Chicago police. That is how her most private secrets became public property. Not through an official investigation, but through a reporter who walked out of a murder scene with the dead woman's diary in his pocket. In the chaos, before the evidence was properly secured, a newspaperman had slipped into the apartment. He snatched up one of her diaries, a personal letter, and some of her photographs, and rushed them to his editor. They were photographed, splashed across the front page as an exclusive scoop, and only then quietly returned to the police. Her secret diaries, her private life, her many names, were suddenly coast-to-coast news. The respectable woman with the hidden double life became a national sensation overnight. The papers gave her a whole collection of nicknames: the Gilded Lady, the Butterfly Girl, even a stranger one drawn from her own habits and diary entries. Each nickname was another layer of legend, piled on top of a woman the public had never heard of the day before, and now could not stop reading about. She had become, in death, exactly the kind of famous she had spent her life quietly orbiting. A glamorous, tragic figure whose secret world the whole country was suddenly devouring over breakfast. But underneath the sensation was a murder, and a murder needs a suspect. So detectives turned from who she was to who could have wanted her dead. And this is where her many-sided life became a trap for the investigators. Because a woman with that many identities and that many powerful connections did not have one obvious enemy. She had a whole hidden landscape of possible ones. Think about the world the diaries revealed. She kept company with wealthy, married men, men with reputations, men with fortunes, and families, and public standing to protect. That opens up two very different motives, and both of them are dangerous. Both of them fit. And both of them, in the end, proved impossible to nail down. The first is jealousy. Where there are wealthy married men, there are wives. A woman who quietly entertained other women's husbands is a woman who could easily become the target of a betrayed and furious wife. Had a jealous spouse discovered where her husband's money and attention was going and decided to end the rivalry permanently? It is a real possibility. And notice how it fits the scene. The killer was someone Audrey let get close, someone whose presence did not alarm her. A woman, perhaps, would not have set off the same alarm as a strange man. Another woman could walk into that hotel, ride up in that elevator, and knock on that door without drawing a second glance. Audrey might have received such a visitor without a flicker of fear, right up until the pistol appeared. Picture it. A confrontation between the woman who paid and the woman who was paid for. Perhaps words, perhaps not even that. Perhaps just a quiet arrival, a seat taken in the chair, and then the shot. It is a theory that fits the calm of the scene almost perfectly. But there is a second motive, and it is even darker. Silence. Audrey Vallette knew things. A woman who moves in those circles, who keeps company with prominent and powerful men, becomes a keeper of secrets. And she wrote things down. She kept diaries. Detailed, unrestrained diaries, full of names and events. To a powerful man with everything to lose, a woman like that is not just a companion. She is a threat. A living, breathing record of things that could destroy a marriage, a career, a fortune, a reputation. And Audrey had just been traveling. She had just returned from seeing one of these men. Had something happened out east? Had she asked for something, or threatened something, or simply learned something she was never meant to know? Had a wealthy admirer decided that the safest diary is one whose author can no longer add to it? We will never know what was in the pages the police did not release, or what was said in the rooms they could never enter. But the shape of the danger is clear. A woman who collects the secrets of powerful men is sitting on a fortune and a death sentence at the same time. So the question the police had to weigh was chilling. Was Audrey Vallette killed by a jealous wife, in a rage over a stolen husband, or was she killed to shut her mouth, to stop her from exposing something, or someone, that could not afford to be exposed. Both motives pointed into the same glittering, secretive world, and both were nearly impossible to prove. Because here is the problem with murdering a woman who has powerful friends and powerful enemies. The very people who might know the truth are the people with the most to lose by telling it. Nobody in that world wanted to talk. Nobody wanted their own name pulled into a scandal involving diaries and a dead courtesan. Every question the detectives asked was met with a shrug, a denial, or a door politely closed. The connections that had made Audrey's gilded life possible were the same connections that now closed ranks and went silent. Imagine being one of those men, opening the newspaper to find that a woman you had known privately, a woman with your secrets in her diaries, had been murdered. Your first instinct would not be to help the police. It would be to make absolutely certain your name never came anywhere near the story, to stay quiet, to know nothing, to have been nowhere. Multiply that instinct across every powerful figure who had ever crossed Audrey's path, and you have a fog of silence that no detective could ever fully see through. The very fame and money that made her interesting were the same forces that buried the truth of her death. And yet, the police did not come away empty-handed, because they did develop a prime suspect. Someone that the investigation focused on, someone they believed was the most likely person to have walked into that room, sat in that chair, and fired that single shot. But a suspect is not a conviction, and whoever the police fixed their attention on, they were never able to make the case stick. Consider how little they truly had. The crime had lasted seconds. One visitor, one shot, one exit. No sign of a break-in, because none was needed. No robbery, because nothing of value seems to have driven it. No screaming struggle for neighbors to hear, because the victim had welcomed her killer in. There was no confession, no weapon tied neatly to a hand, no witness who could place the killer in that chair beyond doubt. Everything that made the crime so clean was the same thing that made it so unsolvable. A trusted visitor and a single bullet leave almost nothing behind. The one shot had been quiet, and quick, and clean. The killer had walked in as a trusted guest, and walked out as a ghost. And the wall of silence around Audrey's secret life did the rest. For a few weeks, the country could not get enough of her. The diaries, the nicknames, the famous faces on her walls, the scandalous glamour of a secret playgirl gunned down in a fine hotel. It was the perfect newspaper story, and the papers wrung every drop from it. And then, as always happens, the country moved on. A new sensation arrived to take her place on the front pages. The diaries stopped being quoted, the nicknames faded, and Audrey Vallette, who had been famous for a season for the way she died, slipped quietly back into the obscurity she had spent her whole life half hiding in. The investigation cooled, the prime suspect walked free, and the pink negligee, the French telephone, the 4 last words, all of it settled into a yellowing file, and then into silence. So the prime suspect was never charged. No handcuffs, no trial, no headline announcing an arrest. The case was never closed with a name, and Audrey Vallette, the woman of many identities, kept her final and most important secret of all, the identity of the person who killed her. Step back and look at the whole strange shape of it. A woman from a respectable family builds a series of false selves. She becomes a cosmetic saleswoman who never sold cosmetics, a divorcee, a gilded companion to powerful men. She fills her walls with the signed faces of the famous, and her drawers with diaries full of dangerous secrets. Every one of those masks was a kind of armor, a way to move through a dangerous world, to keep the different parts of her life from ever colliding, to stay one step ahead of scandal and exposure. For years, it worked. The masks kept her safe, and kept her secrets, and kept her free. And then, in the end, the masks failed her in the cruelest way. Because whoever killed her did not need to see through the disguises. They already knew her. They belonged to the one part of her life she could not hide from, the very world the masks were built to protect. The armor was useless against a threat that was already inside the walls. And then, on an ordinary summer morning, one of the people from that hidden world walks calmly into her room. They sit down beside her, and they end all of her identities at once, with a single bullet. It is a bitter irony. A woman who documented so much, who filled diary after diary with the details of her hidden life, left behind no record of the one thing that mattered most. She wrote down her lovers, her nights, her secrets, her complaints. But she could not write down the future. She had no way to know that the most important entry of all, the name of her own killer, was the one page she would never get to fill. She had time for 4 words. I've been shot. She did not have time to say the one word that would have solved everything. A name. And everyone who might have supplied that name had far too much to lose by ever saying it out loud. That is why this case has never been solved. Not because there were no suspects, but because Audrey Vallette lived in a world built entirely on secrets, and murder was simply the last secret it kept. There is something genuinely haunting in that. Most murder victims leave behind a clear life, and the mystery is only in the final moments. Audrey was the opposite. Her whole life was the mystery. By the time she died, she had hidden herself behind so many names and so many masks. Even in death, the world could not quite agree on who she truly was. The mystery of her killer was really the second mystery. The first was simply her, the Gilded Lady, Annabelle Blake, Audrey Schroeder, Audrey Vallette. So many names for one woman, and not a single one of them belongs to the person who killed her. So the last question is yours to answer. Was it the jealous wife, striking at the woman who had taken her husband's heart and money? Or was it something colder, a powerful figure silencing a woman who knew too much and wrote too much down? After more than 80 years, an honest guess is all any of us can offer. So tell me, down in the comments, which door you would open, the jealous wife or the frightened, powerful man? I will be reading them all, and I genuinely want to know where you land. I read every single one.